it's not a typical place, and you've hunted down. This is going to be your third year down here. It's not a typical place like you're going to come for a week and harvest a mature whitetail. It's very hard to do that here.
Yeah, I would agree.
I mean, even if it was 2 weeks, give you better odds, but it'd be very hard to commit 2 weeks down here and kill mature whitetail. It's even hard for me and the other locals there's a bunch of great deer hunters around here. I mean, bunch of great deer hunters. But it's hard to continue to annually kill a mature buck. And I didn't even know where that deer went. And I didn't have any deer. I mean, I had deer, but we have minimums on the lease, and you're trying to find one of those deer. And then Zach and I were talking, and it was late October. He was like, man, I think you need to go and look for that flower deer. And I was like, dude, I ain't had a picture of him in 6 weeks, 7 weeks. And he was like, I think you ought to go up there and just look around. And I did. I went up there and looked around. Man, I found a car hood scrape. By God, I'm telling you, it was. I mean, it was tore up like a can of kraut. I mean, it was all diced up. I was like, this is as hot as it gets. And I hung a camera up right there, and then I went on out the ridge and found some other sign, but it wasn't like anything like that area that I found those 2 scrapes in. And it was a natural funnel, 2 high knobs, and it was a nice flat going from that soft to hard transition. And that night at like 2:30 in the morning, I got a picture of him on the scrape. I hadn't had a picture in 6, 7, 8 weeks, and he was working that scrape. So the next day, I opted not to go in there early in the morning because when I hung the camera, I didn't even think about picking a tree out because I was like, who knows what's going to be on there, because didn't know. We knew deer was in there, but didn't know what they were. So didn't pick a tree. So went in the next afternoon and hung up in a pawpaw tree. It was terrible. I mean, it might have been an 8 or 10 inch tree. And I think that the limb that Alex and I got in, I'm telling you, it wasn't 7 inches. Like I thought that I was going to break the top of the tree out when I shot the deer. Like I got stoked. And I thought that it was going to break out. It was so skinny. But I wasn't 12 foot in a tree. But that deer, most deer activity that I've experienced since like 2003, 4 when I was in Ohio, never had an evening like that in West Virginia. Probably heard 25 snort wheezes. And you could tell that they were different deer because they all sounded different. And after we were there and in listening to this happening, like this little 10-point, we'd hear him up on the hill in this thicket, and these 2 knobs in this funnel, this choke point, these two knobs were just big thickets. So the deer would run in there and start chasing, and you'd hear him snort wheezing, and you hear him fighting. And we're like, oh, that's that 10-point that was just down here. That's the same snort wheeze. And then we heard like a, I was like, hey man, that's different. And he's like, yeah, that sounded way different. And then we heard another one. I mean, it like I've heard snort wheezing, but I've never heard it that prevalent. Just seemed like every 2 or 3 minutes you'd hear snort wheeze, and then just grunting, and then, I mean, it was nuts. I'm not kidding you. Like I go back and think about it, and it's like I said, I've never experienced it in Southern Four. And when I talk about the Southern Four bow hunt only counties, and this deer, I mean, we've had deer running all over us. We didn't do an interview for 2 hours because all we're doing is action. And a doe comes off the hill and she's so dogged out. She comes and runs into an autumn olive 10 yards from me, and she's hunkered in that autumn olive, scared to death. I'm not, that's true. I'm serious. She's hiding. She's just wanting to get the hell away from these bucks. Because I think, we probably saw 7 or 8 does that evening. And maybe 2 of them were in heat. And this little one, she's been dogged to death. Every buck up there is like after her. And she runs down off one of these knobs, and I'm looking. And she runs 10 yards from us, and she's hunkered, hiding. I mean, like, she's wanting the hell away from these bucks. And she's in the autumn olives, and I hear, and I'm like, Alex. And I was like, that's a different deer. He said, that didn't sound like a deer. I said, dude. And then all of a sudden, come right off out of the thicket. I see him coming. And I'm like, oh my God. Then I about lost my shit. I'm like, that's the flyer deer. And I grab my bow. And he comes down like he's looking for her. And I'm telling you, she ain't moved. I'm telling you, she was hiding scared. I've not seen a deer do that. And that deer comes down, and there was 2 does off to my left that had been bumped. But they weren't in heat. And like that buck comes down, and he looks at those does, and he thought that was one of those hot does. And he starts walking towards them. Of course, he didn't make it to them because I smoked his lungs, thumped his butt. But it wasn't until I shot him and he ran up and crashed, and then I kind of lost my stuff, It didn't until when I lost my stuff that doe finally came out of that autumn olive, and like she just kind of trotted up that other knob. I mean, she was really trying to get away from it, scared to death. And I just thought she stayed tucked in there until she just couldn't stay tucked in there any longer. But yeah, so that was the first deer I killed, and which was just, I'm telling you, man, it was a sick hunt.
Oh yeah, and anybody can watch that hunt. You got it over on YouTube, on the Untamed channel, which is, I'd highly recommend watching it. And it's funny because like the video is absolutely full of action, but you can't even like capture all of the stuff that goes on to be able to be in a video. And that's why like I really wanted to hear it from your mouth, because when you told me it on the phone that day or a couple days later whenever we talked, it was like, yeah, dude, that's insane.
Yeah, so Bo is like on my list to call when something happens. And I call him, and I'm always like, if it's deer season, Bo's like, hey, what's going on? Because he knows something's happening. Like, I'm always like in a frantic state of mind if something happens. And
there's only there's 2 things that happen when Josh calls me during deer season. He either killed a buck, or he's in a bad spot mentally and needs picked up.
That's right.
Those are the 2 options.
We've been through that too. That's right. That's exactly right. But that day, I mean, I'm telling you, like, that 10 point that came up the hill, and you all should go check the video out on the Untamed YouTube channel. A 10 point that I passed, that was he was Poping young, but he didn't meet our minimums on the lease. And we had a lot of comments on there like, how can you not kill that deer? And he was like 7 yards when he came up chasing that doe. And from that point on, and they were scrub bucks, but I've not had that many bucks grunt and snort wheeze. And I mean, hell, the doe that was in heat, and like that small 8-point was on her. Like, I think she wanted bread because another doe started approaching her, and like she stood up on her hind legs and give that other doe like a left right, said, "Hey, this is my man," and like run her off. So I mean, we saw everything that evening. I mean, it was unreal, vocally and just the scene of it.
Yeah.
To see everything that deer hunting has to offer. Like, I was tore up for probably like 30 hours after that hunt. About killed Zach getting out of my Jeep because I was just still lost it, and cracked 2 of his ribs when I speared him. I slipped out of the Jeep and about broke my neck. And, I mean, I was like super stoked, and it was a good deer.
Yeah, beautiful deer.
Yeah, big heavy rack, heavy mass, and I mean, you get that heavy mass down here, and it's a little bit wide, thick, chocolate rack. I mean, they're just like a bow hunter's dream, you know. Not the biggest deer in the world, but you know, he met our minimums, and I was super proud of that deer because where I had him in early season, but then lost him, but that deer came back. So it was a great hunt. I mean, like talking about it now and giving the story, like I'm not like ready to rip my skin off like I was down in Kentucky, but I was stoked.